When Julius Caesar fell dead beneath the statue of Pompey in March 44 BC, it created a power vacuum. And a whole bunch of different men and groups all tried to jump in and fill that void. First of all, there were the conspirators, or as they would call themselves, the liberators, the group of senators who had actually killed Caesar. These were led by Caesar's friend Brutus, and they claimed that their ultimate goal was to restore the Roman Republic. And to reinforce this image, they minted coins, which had stamped on them little images of daggers and triangular caps. The daggers represented the assassination of Caesar, and the caps were the sort of hat traditionally given to slaves when they received their freedom. And so the symbolic meaning of these coins was that they had freed the entire Roman people and state from enslavement by Julius Caesar. On the other hand, there were a number of men who tried to position themselves as the heirs to the legacy of Caesar. And by far, the most prominent of these was Marcus Antonius, or as we commonly call him today, Mark Antony. And he clearly seemed to be the best positioned to just step right into Caesar's place. He had been Caesar's lieutenant for many years. He had been Caesar's his right-hand man, the guy that Caesar would delegate authority to when he himself was somewhere else. Antony was also a pretty good soldier in his own right, and so that enabled him to relate well to Caesar's veterans. Finally, though, when Caesar's will was opened and read, it produced a surprise third candidate. To the shock of almost everyone, and actually to the very great annoyance of Mark Antony, Antony was not named as Caesar's primary heir. Instead, Caesar tapped an utterly obscure grandnephew of his as the primary heir. And what's more, he then posthumously adopted that young boy as his son. This nephew was at the time a teenager who was 18 years old, and he was named Octavian. Antony got control of almost everything from Caesar. He got Caesar's money, he got his records, and he got his legions. So on the surface, it doesn't look like Octavian benefited very much from this adoption. Under Roman law, though, when you were adopted, you could take the name of the person who adopted you. And so Octavian, legally, now became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And the name that he would use in daily life that people would call him was just Caesar. And this might not seem like such a big deal, except for the fact that all around the Mediterranean, there were tens of thousands of battle-hardened veteran soldiers who have been indoctrinated to loyally follow the orders of someone named Gaius Julius Caesar. And so even though it may not quite seem entirely logical, many of those men now transferred their allegiance to the new Caesar, Octavian. And so overnight, this teenage boy had acquired a substantial personal army, and he instantly, therefore, became someone to be reckoned with. The funeral of Julius Caesar was a very memorable event. Mark Antony delivered a laudatory oration in the Roman Forum, during which he displayed Caesar's bloody toga. And he even had constructed this larger-than-life-size wax replica of Caesar's body. And this rather gruesome object was mounted upright on a revolving platform, and it depicted realistically every one of the places where Caesar had been stabbed. And the crowd got so worked up by this sight, together with the oration of Antony, that they rioted, and they spontaneously cremated Julius Caesar's body right there in the Roman Forum. And to provide fuel for this fire, and also clearly as a expression of anger against the assassins, they burnt down the Senate house. The terrified senatorial assassins fled Rome and ran off to the east. And they went that way because that's where their loyal troops were. And so this effectively left Rome in the hands of the two rivals, Antony and Octavian. Octavian managed to put together a private army of about 5 legions, composed of Caesar's veterans. And the Senate was so impressed by this deed, or maybe we should say it was so frightened by this, that they allowed him to run for and be elected consul. And he at this point was just 19 years old. Conflict between Antony and Octavian seemed pretty much inevitable, but neither was quite ready. Both wanted some time to prepare. Both were still worried about Caesar's assassins and the senatorial armies that were off in the east. So these two rivals then forged an alliance in which they pledged to work together for a while against Brutus and the other assassins/liberators. In 42 BC, the decisive battle was fought between these two factions. And Octavian, who really was not a good general, was defeated on his part of the battlefield. But Mark Antony, who was a pretty good general, was victorious in his section, and that was enough to secure an overall victory. Brutus and the other senatorial assassins were either captured, killed, or committed suicide. With the liberators now out of the picture, the situation had clarified and come down again to the two men squaring off to see who would take over Rome. But still, neither was quite ready for open war. So they decided they would simply divide up the Roman world between them. Mark Antony was clearly the elder partner in this coalition, the stronger one, and so he got first pick, and he chose the eastern half, which remembers the richer half. That left Octavian with the western half. And to cement their agreement, Octavian married his sister to Antony. Antony, now established off in the east, ended up in Egypt, where he met Cleopatra, or I should say renewed his acquaintance with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. And soon those two were engaged in their famous love affair. And it became so heated that eventually Antony sent back Octavian's sister to him and openly took up with Cleopatra, which was quite offensive to Octavian. By aligning himself with her, Antony then gained the use of the large Egyptian army and navy, and probably more importantly, the vast Egyptian treasury. Octavian could not hope to match Antony's financial resources. So he took a different path. He began to wage what, I suppose in modern terms, we would call a war of propaganda against Antony. Octavian posed as the champion of the Roman Republic, and he tried to portray that he was defending the Republic against a dangerous foreign enemy personified by Cleopatra. And remember, since Cleopatra was a queen, by presenting himself as her consort, Antony had fallen into the trap of looking like a king, which remember the Romans hate. And so Octavian was very adeptly able to exploit that traditional Roman fear and hatred of kings. Octavian did all kinds of things. He spread rumors that Cleopatra wanted to conquer Rome and then move the capital of the entire empire to Alexandria in Egypt. And even Romans who really weren't so crazy about Octavian were offended by the thought that the capital might be moved to Egypt. And so Octavian was very, very successful in painting Antony as having fallen under the seductive power of a foreign queen. And that's a stereotype we still have about Cleopatra today. So Octavian transformed what in reality was a civil war between two Romans into what looked like a war of a Roman against an Eastern enemy. And that was a very clever strategy. Having laid this groundwork, Octavian then manipulated the Senate and had them declare that Cleopatra was officially a public enemy of the Roman state. And this was an absolutely brilliant move because it put Antony in a difficult position. Either he had to sever his ties with Cleopatra, and if he did that, he would lose all of that financial backing, or he could remain loyal to her, and then he would legally find himself in collusion with someone who is an official enemy of Rome. Now, Antony, who really did seem to have fallen genuinely in love with Cleopatra, chose to stay faithful to her and to stay with her. All of this maneuvering back and forth actually took about a decade. But finally, the war between the two men broke out. And Antony was clearly a better general than Octavian. But luckily for Octavian, he had a loyal friend whose name was Agrippa, who not only was an excellent military strategist, but even better, was always willing to let Octavian claim the credit for the victories that he won. And Antony also seemed to have a big advantage having a larger army and more resources. But Agrippa, who was a very clever general, seized control of the sea, he blockaded Antony's army, and that caused a lot of starvation and disease and weakened it substantially. The final decisive battle between these two groups took place just off the coast of Greece, at a place called Actium, and we're down now to 31 BC. The Battle of Actium was a naval battle, and Octavian was not only a terrible general, but also a lousy sailor. And so one source tells us that he spent the entire battle below decks in his bunk, stricken with seasickness and vomiting. But good old Agrippa, however, was also a good admiral, and he outmaneuvered Antony and defeated him. Antony and Cleopatra both escaped from the battle, and they fled to Egypt. And as I'm sure you know, they there committed suicide. Octavian had now gained control of the Roman world, but he faced his greatest challenge. And it was the same challenge that Julius Caesar had faced. And that was, how do you rule Rome as one man, but avoid being killed for looking like a king? Caesar had found himself in this situation too. And despite all of his talents, Caesar had failed when faced with this dilemma. Octavian, at least, could look back at the negative example which had been set by Caesar. And so he could identify some things that he had to avoid doing. First of all, he had to be sure that he did not act in an arrogant manner like Caesar had. Secondly, he could not monopolize offices like the consulship, which Caesar had held a whole bunch of times in a row, because this would cause resentment among the aristocrats, who themselves wanted to hold those offices. Third, he knew he had to respect tradition and to not appear to be making any dramatic changes either in the state or in creating new institutions. It was a good thing that Octavian was a mastermind of propaganda, because his solution to these problems was absolutely brilliant. A lot of the success of his settlement of the Roman state rested upon an insight. And the insight was that he could actually get away with introducing new institutions as long as he gave the illusion that he was not doing that. Octavian realized that appearances sometimes matter a lot more than reality, and he exploited that strategy to the maximum. First of all, like Caesar, he wanted to have the various powers of Roman magistrates, such as being consul. And the way he engineered this was simple but inspired. Octavian arranged it so that he was given the powers of the office of consul, but not the office itself. In other words, each year, the Romans would go ahead and elect 2 consuls, just as they always had throughout the whole history of the Republic. And nominally, those 2 men were running the state for that year. Lurking behind them, however, and holding equivalent powers was Octavian, who also had the power of a consul. But he was not exercising that power on a day-to-day basis. And the really smart thing was that Octavian didn't just receive the powers of a consul, but he also had himself awarded the powers of every other Roman magistracy as well. So, for example, he was granted the powers of a tribune. That meant he could do things like propose new laws, or he could use the tribunician veto. But again, he was not formally one of the elected tribunes for any one year. So aristocrats could continue to compete, they could run for offices just as they always had. And it looked like they were the ones running the state. But sort of, I guess, floating above this entire system was Octavian. And if he needed to, at any moment, he could invoke one of his many powers and get his way. And Octavian could somewhat legitimately claim that he wasn't doing anything new or innovative, since all the powers that he held were old traditional Republican ones. He faced another big challenge, though, and that was simply what to call himself. After all, he needed some kind of title or name that would suggest the status he held. Obviously, though, he couldn't use the term king. I mean, there's no chance of that. So at first, since he was making the claim that he had refounded the Republic, he considered taking the name Romulus, after the original founder of the city. But very soon he realized that he couldn't do that. That would be bad, because Romulus, of course, actually had been a king. And ultimately, he again found a clever solution that again had to do with manipulation of images. What he did was he adopted a whole series of different names, none of which individually seemed that overwhelming or threatening. But collectively, they clearly indicated he was the head of the state. The first of those titles, which became part of his official name, was Augustus. And this is derived from a Latin root word which implies either a devotion to the gods, or maybe that the object called Augustus itself possesses divine qualities. And that very ambiguity of meaning was perfect for Octavian, because on the one hand, then he could claim that this title simply meant he was very pious, he respected the gods. But on the other hand, it subtly suggested that he was a little bit closer to the gods than ordinary men. And by historical convention, Augustus is the name by which we tend to refer to Octavian once he took over the state. So this is just something historians have decided. And so once he becomes the first Roman emperor, we call him Augustus. So from this point on, I'll also call him Augustus, but keep in mind Augustus and Octavian are the same guy. Another title slash name that he acquired was Princeps. And this one literally translates as something like first citizen, or maybe first among equals. And again, that term has a lot of useful ambiguity to it. So on the one hand, you can interpret it fairly modestly, and the title simply seems to say that he's a citizen. It emphasizes that status. And that's a status he shares with all other Roman citizens. But on the other hand, it also somehow implies that he's superior to other citizens. He's the first among the equals, and he's their leader. Also, by the way, this is the word from which the English term prince is derived. The next of the titles that he took was Pater Patriae. Now, unlike Augustus and Princeps, which have all these multiple possible meanings, this one very precisely translates as Father of the Country. The ambiguity comes in, though, when you consider the connotations of that term. So, on the one hand, a father conjures up associations of someone who is compassionate, who is caring, who lovingly looks after his children. But on the other hand, in Roman society, a father was a very imposing figure, and he was someone who demanded absolute respect and obedience from those in his family. By law, Roman fathers even had the power of life and death over the people within his family. Finally, he took another title, and this one was Imperator. And this again was a well-established traditional term. This one had its origins in a kind of spontaneous acclamation or a shout that soldiers would give to a victorious general after a battle if they thought the general had done a good job. And so this term carries connotations of military skill and success. And it's from this term imperator that the English words emperor and empire are derived. And those are then applied to Rome and its rulers. Now, every one of these terms was at the same time an official title, but it also was really part of his name. And each one of these terms suggested a different aspect of Augustus's power. And every subsequent Roman emperor who came along after him would also adopt all of these names or titles as part of their official name/title. The final element in Augustus's consolidation of power was that he acted modestly. He had learned to avoid the arrogance that Julius Caesar had shown. So Augustus lived in a very small, ordinary house. He ate simple food. He always dressed in a humble fashion, just looking like every other citizen. And he always treated senators with courtesy and respect. And also, sort of working in his favor, was the fact that after decades now of civil war, people were simply eager for peace. A lot of Romans, I think, were willing to accept and maybe even believe this sort of fiction being sold by Augustus that the Republic had come back and been restored because it meant there would be an end to all of the destructive wars that had been plaguing Rome for quite a while. Augustus's actions were incredibly influential. He had invented or created a new state and a new sort of government. And he established the model that would be followed for hundreds of years after him. And it's with him that the Republic ends and that third and final phase of Roman history, the Empire, begins. One more thing that helped to make his settlement of the Roman state long-lasting was that he himself lived a really long time. He gained power as a teenager, he eliminated all of his rivals by 31 BC, and then he continued to rule all the way down until his death in AD 14. And by the time Augustus finally died, there, quite literally, was almost no one else left alive who could remember the days of the true Roman Republic. He had outlived everyone else. And all his life, he continued his clever use of propaganda and manipulation of his public image. He would do things like patronize poets who would craft laudatory accounts of his actions. He would fund massive construction projects, which were adorned with artwork and decoration, all of which eulogized his reign and sugar-coated all of his machinations. Augustus also wrote an autobiography. And considering that he had brought the entire Mediterranean world under his sway, he labeled this work with typical understatement and modesty, the res gestae, which literally translates as stuff that I did. And it's a masterpiece of propaganda that rather blandly just glosses over the actions he does or the things that he doesn't want remembered while emphasizing the things that he wants to stress. Let me read you the opening lines of this. The res gestae begins, "At the age of 19, at my own expense and initiative, I raised an army, and I used it to defend the liberty of the Republic when it was oppressed by a faction." Now, we might more accurately rewrite that line as, "At the age of 19, I raised a private army to fight a civil war against the lawfully elected magistrates of the Roman state." But he goes on to boast not about the offices he held, but instead he boasts about the honors that he turned down. And he lists in great detail all of the benefactions that he bestowed on the citizens of Rome. For example, when describing his takeover of power in the Roman state, he rather mildly comments that, quote, "I held no office which was inconsistent with the customs of our ancestors," end quote. Now, this restoration could easily be interpreted as destruction. And while that final phrase is true in a strict sense, it certainly doesn't reflect the realities of his power. In terms of Augustus's foreign policy, the rapid expansion of the empire's borders, which we've seen in the last couple centuries, mostly stops. And in general, Augustus concentrated on solidifying what Rome already had, rather than gaining new lands. So after Antony and Cleopatra were defeated at Actium, Egypt was turned into tax-paying Roman province, and Rome now controlled a continuous ring of territory all the way around the Mediterranean Sea. The one time when Augustus tried to expand the empire's borders actually ended up being one of Rome's greatest military disasters. As a result of Caesar's campaigns, all of Gaul was now Roman provinces. And the border of Gaul with the unknown was the Rhine River. And on the other side of the Rhine were a bunch of very fierce Germanic tribes. And during Augustus's reign, the Romans periodically made incursions into that region. And just 5 years before Augustus's death, in 9 AD, a Roman general named Verus was sent with 3 Roman legions on such an expedition. Verus, though, was really a lawyer. He was an incompetent general. He was tricked by a local German leader named Hermann, who pretended to be an ally of Rome, but really lured Verus and his men out into an ambush. The Romans always fought best on open, flat ground, where their discipline gave them an advantage. But Verus was enticed by Hermann into these swampy and dense Germanic forests. And there, the Germans were able to attack the disorganized Roman formations, and Verus and all 3 legions were massacred. This was an embarrassing defeat, and Augustus seems to have taken the loss of those legions particularly hard. One source tells us that for the rest of his reign, he was prone to occasionally banging his head against the wall while moaning, "Verus, give me back my legions." Despite that one disaster, in general, Augustus's reign was a great success. He brought peace and stability after almost 100 years of discord. He was able to become emperor because he figured out a way to hold real power in Rome without looking, at least too obviously, like he was doing it. 2 interesting questions concerning Augustus continue to be debated today. And these are, did he, in some sense, really restore the Republic, as he claimed? Or did he destroy it? And secondly, was he a traditionalist who was just adapting old institutions to fit new realities? Or was he an innovator who was creating completely new institutions and disguising them with old labels? Despite all of his cleverness that I've been emphasizing, there's one area in which Augustus failed miserably. This was in finding a way to pass on power to the next emperor, and to make sure that that emperor was well qualified. Part of the problem was the ambiguous nature of the position he had created. I mean, how do you transfer something that really doesn't formally exist? And probably his greatest mistake was choosing to select the next emperor on the basis of heredity. By establishing a precedent of passing power to the nearest male relative, Augustus would doom Rome to a string of incompetent, sometimes even mentally imbalanced emperors over the next 100 years or so. One unexpected drawback to his long lifespan was that Augustus actually outlived his first 4 choices for a successor. And these included even 2 of his grandchildren who died before him. In the end, the heir who managed to still be alive at the time when Augustus died was not a person that he would have chosen. This was a stepson of his named Tiberius. And at the time Tiberius inherited the throne, he was already 55 years old. And he had a very grim, kind of serious personality, and also had a social awkwardness. And at least initially, though, despite all that, he wasn't a bad emperor. He worked conscientiously. But later in his life, he withdrew to a palace on the island of Capri, and basically gave himself up to all sorts of paranoia and sexual overindulgence. And Tiberius died in 37 AD. The next set of emperors will have several names among them who were notorious for insanity and debauchery, including Caligula and Nero. Augustus's decision to base imperial succession on the principle of heredity and blood relationships would end up having dire consequences for all of Roman history. The next lecture will follow the history of the first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire. And this is a period when it would experience both notable highs and lows. While the empire would have to endure reigns of people like Caligula and Nero, it would also flourish under the management of good emperors, such as Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. And during this time, the empire would reach its greatest geographical extent and achieve its economic and cultural apex. But the factors that would eventually cause its collapse would also begin to show themselves. Thank you.